Do you ever wonder how long humans have been dealing with sustainability issues? Well, in this video, I'm going to go back 8,000 years. And be sure you watch to the end because I'm going to discuss an event that I believe changed the trajectory of human history with regard to sustainability forever and for the better. Welcome everyone, my name is Holly Fortenberry and this is Beyond Sustainable Living. On this channel, I discuss and teach sustainability concepts and practices to help people live a more abundant, connected, and sustainable life. If you're new here and like this topic, please consider subscribing. Humans have dealt with the struggles and the concepts of sustainability ever since we left the hunter-gatherer nomadic life during the Neolithic Revolution and settled into agrarian societies whose economy centered around farming. The historic people and events I'm going to discuss in this video are Mesopotamia, the Aztec Empire, India, Bhutan, René Descartes, and the European Enlightenment, Georg Hartig and John Stuart Mill, Henry David Thoreau and John Muir, the Canadian Commission on Conservation, Bretton Woods Conference, and Rachel Carson. And at the end, I'm going to talk about an event that's a surprise. So stay tuned for that. One of the most well understood of these agrarian societies was Mesopotamia, in current-day Iraq and Iran. The Fertile Crescent is the boomerang-shaped region in the Middle East that was home to some of the earliest human civilizations. Also known as the Cradle of Civilization, this area was the birthplace of a number of technological innovations, including writing, the wheel, agriculture, water management, and the use of irrigation. These innovations also led to issues we now associate with sustainability. Beginning around 6000 BC, people of the region began digging simple, small-scale canals for irrigating small plots of land. By 3000 BC, canals had become enormous in scale, transforming the landscape and even being used for transportation between cities. Saddled with the huge responsibility of their upkeep, neighboring kings would even work together to maintain their central infrastructure. There was a downside, however, to the prosperity water management brought. Booming populations outstripped the fertility of the land. Stagnant water bred disease, and variability in the landscape, weather, and use led to conflict over land access and rights, similar issues that we see today. The World Health Organization today estimates that more than 3.4 million people die from water-related diseases every year. Experts wonder how we can feed 7 billion humans, and conflict over water rights continues among individual farmers and even entire nations. While the people of Mesopotamia may not have solved these issues, it seems that in some ways they may have had more sustainable thinking. From symbolically decorated vases to the nature of some of their gods, these people recognized at a practical and spiritual level how fundamentally important it is to have reliable access to clean water. Enki, the god of drinkable water, with streams and fish pouring forth from his shoulders, was seen as one of humanity's greatest friends. The Mesopotamians were not the only ones with advanced practices. The Aztec Empire had advanced systems not seen in their time anywhere else. When Europeans arrived in the early 1500s, the Aztecs had one of the largest empires at that time, with a population over 200,000. With a massive size and impressive organization and cleanliness, the Aztec Empire could be considered one of the more sustainable empires in history. The Aztecs maintained systems of organization of resources that would be admired in today's society. The foundation of their sustainability comes down to their use of small artificial islands known as chinampas that they built to accommodate the growing population. The Aztec chinampas covered over 12 square kilometers or 7 square miles and were highly productive due to the high amount of water and sunlight in the area. The productivity was further increased by recycling of nutrients. The Aztecs had a method for disposing organic waste that would fertilize the crops. Human excrement was often used and highly valued in the Aztec society. Urine was also stored and sold. Reusing excrement prevented it from being released into the environment and prevented the pollution of the lakes surrounding the Chinampas. Littering and dumping waste was highly frowned upon in Aztec society. Wastefulness was not tolerated at all, and in some cases individuals would be sentenced to death for being wasteful. They even had a system for recovering recyclable waste. They also maximized recycling by burning certain materials and then disposing their remainder in the Chinampas, which helped fertilize the soil. The Aztec Empire had managed to create and maintain what we would consider today a sustainable materials management system, which is considered the most ideal method for managing waste, conserving resources, and protecting the environment. Although they had an ideal system of sustainability, the empire did not survive the militant conquest of the Spaniards. After conquering the Aztecs, the Spaniards dismantled the waste management system, drained all of the lakes, and built Mexico City over the land. With their constant reuse and recycling of organic minerals, they minimized their impact on the environment. Because their waste was also considered a resource, they showed no signs of exhausting these resources, which is a major issue in the topic of sustainability today. In addition to their sustainable waste management practices, they also had a more sustainable mindset regarding the natural world. For indigenous Mesoamericans, the experience and consciousness of the animal world were very different from that of the modern Western city dweller. Many a city dweller has lost the one link with the surrounding world that could be most enriching to their well-being, the capacity for wonder, admiration, and reverence for the natural world. The indigenous person, by contrast, thought about him or herself as being closely linked to animals, plants, rocks, and even objects created by people, to which were attributed a spirit and will, similar to that of humans. For the indigenous person, the natural world was not something to be manipulated, exploited, and destroyed for humans at their pleasure, as it has been for Western culture. Rather, it was a sphere populated by supernatural powers and forces with which people had to forge ties necessary for the survival of humankind and for the conservation of nature, and as the context in which sacred beings manifested themselves. Thus, the consciousness of that unknown sphere was a religious experience. For the Aztecs, animals embodied divine energy because they possessed vital forces and physical powers beyond that of humans, such as flying, having claws, and surviving underwater. In particular, some animals were considered to be extraordinary beings that revealed the sacrosanct. They therefore became symbols of natural bodies and elements such as stars and rain, and of the levels of the universe in which divine forces materialized. With sustainability being a prominent issue today, applying some of the theories and viewpoints that the Aztec Empire used regarding waste, adaptability, resources, and the animal world could help reduce the massive effect that modern-day society has on the environment. Sustainable practices have existed throughout history all the way across the planet as well. In India, sustainability has always been a core component of Indian culture. Its philosophy and values have underscored a sustainable way of life. For example, the yogic principle of aparigraha. In Hinduism and Jainism, aparigraha is Sanskrit. It's the virtue of non-possessiveness, non-grasping, or non-greediness, which is a virtue of being non-attached to materialistic possessions, keeping only what is necessary at a certain stage of life. Also in Indian culture, humans and nature share a harmonious relationship, which goes as far as a reverence for various plants and animals. This has aided biodiversity conservation efforts. A great example is of the Bishnoi community in the Jodhpur region, Rajasthan, for whom the protection of wildlife is part of their faith. Another example, the Mesopotamia lion, also called the Asiatic lion, now only has a range in India. Its historic range was across Asia and the Middle East, including Mesopotamia. I wonder if we would have any Asiatic lions left if it were not for India and their harmonious respect for plants and animals. Also, yoga and Ayurveda are perhaps among the most well-known ways of holistic Indian living that contribute to a sustainable life. Eastern philosophies and religions, such as Zen Buddhism, also recognize the connection between humanity and nature, emphasizing that there is no such thing as an independent self, and that all things depend on others for their existence and well-being. For example, strongly influenced by Mahayana Buddhism, Bhutan has enshrined ecological resilience into its constitution, mandating that at least 60% of the nation remain forested. The country is one of just 2 in the world to absorb more carbon than it emits. It measures progress not by gross domestic product GDP, but against, quote, a gross national happiness index, which prioritizes human and ecological well-being over boundless economic growth. Things began to change in 1600 as famous philosopher René Descartes emerged as one source of the Western thought that nature was something to be controlled and managed by humans. In the early 17th century, French father of modern philosophy René Descartes framed the world as essentially split between the realm of mind and that of inert matter. As the only rational beings, Descartes saw humans as wholly separate from and superior to nature and non-human animals, who were considered mere mindless machines to be mastered and exploited at will. Descartes' work was hugely influential in shaping modern conceptions of science and human and animal identities in Western society. Philosopher Val Plumwood was among the first to suggest that it is these attitudes themselves that cause the world's environmental crises. For example, when we talk of, quote, natural resources and, quote, fish stocks, we are suggesting that the Earth's fabric holds no value apart from what it produces for us. That mindset leads us to exploit it recklessly. Scholars such as Timothy Morton and Bruno Latour remind us that viewing the natural world as separate from humans is not only ethically problematic, but empirically false. Microorganisms in our gut aid digestion, while others compose part of our skin. Pollinators such as bees and wasps help produce the food we eat, while photosynthetic organisms such as trees and phytoplankton in the ocean provide the oxygen that we need in order to live, and in turn take up the carbon dioxide we expel. The discussion of the concept of sustainability can be found from the time of the European Enlightenment around 1700, when the unsustainable use of resources and their social and economic impact sparked concerns. The Enlightenment movement, occurring during the 1600s and 1700s, split into 2 branches, one which promoted sustainability and the other capitalism. Capitalism, led by Adam Smith, valued deregulation and the growth of consumption, population, private wealth, and industrial technological inventions such as the cotton gin, steam engine, and power loom. All contributed to expanding pollution, but the steam engine was especially powerful and very polluting. The branch of the Enlightenment that was the source of the concept of sustainability rose out of forestry concerns. A Saxon mining administrator and forestry expert, Hans Karl von Carlowitz, first coined the term sustainability, Nachhaltigkeit, in Germany. He ran the Saxony silver mine that needed trees to heat forged tools and hold up walls. But trees were the main source of fuel before coal displaced it in the late 1700s and 1800s. He wrote a treatise on the sustainable use of forests, drawing on forestry codes written by John Evelyn in England and Jean-Baptiste Colbert in France. But his was unique in its advocacy of sustained yield forestry. The core of the belief was that human societies should live and thrive within their limits. Unfortunately, this belief system was drowned out at that time by the powerful emerging force of industrialization. In the 1800s, the Industrial Revolution brought rapid growth. You know, it strikes me as interesting how we all want to live within our means, and we really should. That's a great idea financially. But why don't people see that with the environment? Like, why would you want to live within your financial means individually, but then not think about your environmental means? Because these are all contexts within which we have to survive and make the best. And I don't understand why people don't see the environment as their means to live within. Maybe they don't understand the scale, so they just don't think about it, or they just really don't care because it doesn't affect them personally, which I find a problem with that morally. But I just think it's something to consider and really think about, because it's very interesting. We all want to live within our means, but it's not just our own little specific little job in our family. There is a larger means that we need to work within as well. I don't know. I just think that's interesting. People don't talk about that too much. They don't think about it as a general rule. And I honestly think that for many people, they just can't think of it on the scale. They don't see themselves as part of it. So that's something I wish people would really think about more. Just ponder that and think about your place in the world, not just within your community, but in the world. In the 1800s, the Industrial Revolution brought rapid production and growth, urbanization, air and water pollution, and worker exploitation. If you've never read the book The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, which details these exploitations, I highly recommend it. In 1804, the term sustainability appeared in forestry studies in Germany as people began to manage the timber harvest for use as a continued resource. When German forestry researcher Georg Hartig described sustainability as utilizing forest to the greatest extent possible, but still in a way that future generations will have as much benefit as the living generation. In 1848, John Stuart Mill was the most influential English language philosopher of the 19th century. He was a naturalist, a utilitarian, and a liberal whose work explores the consequences of a thoroughgoing empiricist outlook. He sought to combine the best of 18th century Enlightenment thinking with newly emerging currents of 19th century Romantic and historical philosophy. His most important works include System of Logic in 1843, On Liberty 1859, and Utilitarianism 1861. He said that, quote, economic growth should not continue indefinitely, but should culminate in a stationary state in which people are happy and prosperous. In 1854, Henry David Thoreau published Walden, or Life in the Woods. Thoreau was an American author, poet, philosopher, abolitionist, naturalist, tax resister, development critic, surveyor, historian, and leading transcendentalist. He is best known for his book Walden, a reflection upon simple living in natural surroundings, and his essay Civil Disobedience, an argument for individual resistance to civil government and moral opposition to an unjust state. Thoreau is seen by many people as the father of the modern environmental sustainability movement. He's a hero of sustainability, and his ideas, expounded in 20 volumes of writings, have influenced many other heroes of sustainability. Thoreau was deeply interested in the idea of survival in the face of hostile elements, historical change, and natural decay. At the same time, he advocated abandoning waste and illusion in order to discover life's true essential needs. He was a lifelong abolitionist, delivering lectures that attacked the fugitive slave law. Thoreau's philosophy of civil disobedience later influenced the political thoughts and actions of such notable figures as Leo Tolstoy, Mohandas Gandhi, and Martin Luther King Jr. One often cited quote of Henry David Thoreau is, Go confidently in the direction of your dreams. Live the life you imagine. As you simplify your life, the laws of the universe will be simpler. As of 1870s, many ecologists and environmentalists understood that industrial growth would have a negative impact on the natural world and that the environment, economics, and social well-being were intimately connected. One of these, John Muir's work, is the origin of the 3 E's of sustainability: environment, equity, and economics. This is now often thought of as planet, people, and profit, the 3 P's. John Muir, also known as John of the Mountains and father of national parks, was an influential Scottish-American naturalist, author, environmental philosopher, botanist, zoologist, glaciologist, and early advocate for the preservation of wilderness in the United States. His letters, essays, and books describing his adventures in nature, especially in the Sierra Nevada, have been read by millions of people. For example, in September 1867, Muir undertook a walk of about 1,000 miles, 1,600 kilometers, from Kentucky to Florida, which he recounted in his book, A 1,000-Mile Walk to the Gulf. He had no specific route chosen except to go by, quote, the wildest, leafiest, and least trodden way I could find. His activism helped to preserve the Yosemite Valley and Sequoia National Park, and his example has served as an inspiration for the preservation of many other wilderness areas. The Sierra Club, which he co-founded, is a prominent American conservation organization. In his later life, Muir devoted most of his time to the preservation of the western forests. On September 30th, 1890, the U.S. Congress passed a bill that essentially followed the recommendations that Muir had suggested in 2 Century articles, The Treasures of the Yosemite and Features of the Proposed National Park, both published in 1890. In 1909, the Commission of Conservation was established to provide Canadian governments with the most up-to-date scientific advice on the conservation of human and natural resources. The wastefulness of the common methods of resource exploitation was widely admitted, and the conservation movement was beginning to offer alternative approaches. In 1915, Canadian Commission on Conservation proclaimed that each generation is entitled to the interest on the natural capital, but the principle should be handed on unimpaired. I talked about this in more detail in my video published last week, What is Sustainability? Then we had 2 world wars, and hyper-industrialism characterized by consumerism and consumption persisted unabated until the end of the 1960s, when society began to see themselves as part of nature and not separate from it, due to an amazing, life-changing event for most humans that I'll discuss at the end of this video. This next set of events brings us closer to current times, but I need to give some context first. World War II had just ended in September 1945, and major developed countries who had been major participants in both wars had determined that economic problems after World War I were the cause of the Second World War. Back in the previous year, July 1944, at the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference held at Bretton Woods, thereafter referred to as simply Bretton Woods, they identified the need for 2 major changes. 1, the expansion of international trade, and 2, a functional payment system. In December 1945, out of this conference was produced the Articles of Agreement of the International Monetary Fund of the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Bretton Woods established a system of payments which defined all currencies relative to the U.S. dollar, and fixed the value of the U.S. dollar itself to a quantity of gold. This was called the gold standard. This made the United States dollar the world's reserve currency, which gave the U.S. a major economic advantage still felt to this day. Over the next 2 decades after Bretton Woods, through the mid-1970s, the world entered a period of escalating growth and economic prosperity known as the Golden Age of Capitalism. This industrial and commercial expansion further propelled rapid growth in the population, resource depletion and pollution, all at alarming rates. In the 1960s, the idea of continuous growth had begun to be questioned as the negative effects of constant growth were growing, such as unlimited reign by free markets, colonial exploitation of non-Western societies, which I'll do a video about in the future because I really want to make people aware of these critically important but often overlooked events, and a complete disregard for the biosphere. This explosion of growth lasted until 1973, when Nixon severed the link between gold and the US dollar, taking the US dollar off the gold standard and breaking the Bretton Woods Agreement with the countries. In 1962, Rachel Carson wrote a now famous book, Silent Spring, in which she explained the interconnectedness of humans and their economies with the environment. This was the precursor to the 3 pillars of sustainability model that we think of today. She also revealed how the chemical industry was spreading disinformation about the use of pesticides and how government officials were accepting this without question. This led to public outcry, which caused the reversal of the U.S.'s national pesticide policy and a nationwide ban of one of those pesticides, DDT, for agricultural uses, and was pivotal in the birth of the environmental movement that led to the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, in the United States. I'd like to provide an example that hits close to home for me personally. The creation of the EPA came at a critical moment in history for the brown pelican. For the previous 30 or so years, from 1945 to 1972, one notable example of the effects of DDT was on our beautiful brown pelican populations. Watching these magnificent birds are a favorite pastime of many coastal residents, as these birds skillfully and forcefully dive bomb into the water after fish and glide in V formation with their majestic 7-foot wingspans over our beaches and coastal neighborhoods. Their numbers plummeted in the 3 decades between the 40s and the 70s as they ate the fish, which were contaminated with DTD. This caused their eggshells to become thin and fragile, causing breakage during incubation. Brown pelicans had almost completely disappeared along the Gulf Coast, and they were put on the endangered species list as endangered or becoming extinct in much of their range. In 1972, the EPA banned DDT, and contaminant levels have since decreased with a corresponding rise in brown pelican nesting success. I never got to see these birds in my childhood visits to the coast, but fortunately today on the Gulf Coast we are grateful to have these beautiful birds back, and I love watching them. It was also during this time that many important environmental movements and organizations around the world came into being. Towards the end of this period of exploding growth and pollution, leading up to the creation of the EPA, the world experienced a huge shift in their understanding of our Earth that I personally believe got into our individual and collective psyche and changed humanity forever for the better. All right, you guys, put a comment below if you think you have an idea or a guess what the event is that changed history. And this is my opinion, but it's not just my opinion. A lot of people think this, and I really believe this event changed the history, not just for sustainability, but for mankind. So put your guess in. In 1968, when I was just 8 months old, the Space Shuttle Apollo astronauts took the photo Earthrise on their trip to the moon.
Oh my God, look at that picture over there. There's the Earth coming up. Wow, that's pretty. Hey, don't take that, it's not scheduled. You got a color film, Jim? Hand me a roll of color, quick.
Oh man, that's great. Where is it?
Quick.
Down here?
Just grab me a color. A color exterior. Hurry up. That one?
Yeah, I'm looking for one. C368.
Anything, quick.
Here.
What?
Hey, I got it right here. Let me get up this left there. Bill, I got a phrase that's very clear right here. You got it? Yep.
Take several.
Take several of them. Here, give it to me.
Wait a minute, let me just get the right setting here. Calm down, Bubble.
Oh, I got it right. Oh, that's a beautiful shot. 250 at F11.
It was the first photo ever taken of the Earth, and the first time humans had ever seen the Earth from an outside perspective. Prior to this, humans only knew the Earth visually from the perspective of being on Earth, looking across the horizon. Earthrise is considered the most influential environmental photo ever taken. I truly believe Earthrise was the spark that inspired the modern-day environmental movement and has fixed it into our motivations to this day. Well, that's it for this week. Please come back next week for the History of Sustainability Part 2, where I will talk about how, after Earthrise, we finally started taking things more seriously. I want to do a shout out to Kelsey, Paul P, and ST for requesting that I do this video on history and the history of sustainability. And I just want to say thanks, guys. This was a really fun video. I learned a lot. And there's going to be a part 2 coming up in a week or two. So stay tuned for that.
All right. Have a happy week. Bye-bye.